Right, I think we will make a start. If anybody else is coming, they can join us later. So good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this Paris Smith Charity Forum specialist webinar on village halls and community centres. I'm Nick Vaughan. I'm the senior partner of Paris Smith, and I head up the firm's charity team. We have an excellent panel of speakers for you today, and I will introduce each of those as we get to their presentations. Just a brief note about the Charity Forum for those of you who are new to us. It was set up in 2012. It now has 400 members, and the purpose was to provide support and assistance to everybody involved with charities, whether they be trustees, officers, or volunteers. And that's provided through seminars, webinars such as this, an annual conference, although we haven't been able to run that in the last couple of years, with keynote speakers from the Charity Commission, fundraising regulator, and others. But more importantly, to provide a safe environment for all those involved in charities to exchange ideas, and exchange best practice within the sector. The forum is free. It's available to individuals working with charities. So if that is something that you think might be of interest to you or to anybody else that you know that is a trustee or works for the charity, then please let us know. We'd be delighted to send you details. A couple of housekeeping notes just before we start. Hopefully everybody is muted at the moment. If not, if I could ask you to do so. The first session is going to be interactive. So you will be able to unmute yourselves if you wish to say anything, but if I could ask you just then to mute again, just so we avoid having any background noise. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end, and if I could ask you to use the chat function. And that's why if you could mute yourselves, that would be great. If you could use the chat function, then we will get through as many questions as possible. We've had some questions raised already. As they're quite specialist, we'll deal with those outside of the seminar, but thank you for those who have sent those in. All of the slides and the presentations will be available after the webinar is finished. The webinar is being recorded, so if you want to put your camera on, to put your camera off, so as you don't inadvertently appear in the recording, please feel free to do so. So I think that covers most things. There will be a feedback form which will be available when you exit the session. And if I could ask you please to complete that, it's very helpful, not just about how this session has gone, but for us to be able to plan for future events. So if I could ask you just to take a couple of minutes to complete that, that would be great. So the first session is on governance, governance issues facing village halls and community centres. In the government's latest publication dealing with village halls, the same applies to community centres, it said, and I quote, "It recognises that village halls, community centres and other charities providing space and facilities for community services and activities can make an enormous difference to the well-being of their communities. These charities are an extremely important resource with a crucial role to play in the economic and social regeneration of their local communities." Now, you will know more than anybody how badly the sector has been affected by the pandemic, with the closure of public venues, the uncertainty over reopening, when could we open, what we're able to do, the loss of income, staff furloughs, but more importantly, perhaps the loss of the hubs that such centres provide to the communities, in particular to the very people who use the facilities who were themselves vulnerable and isolated. It is definitely the case that those charities that are well run and who put governance at the fore of everything that they do will survive and will continue to make a huge difference to their local communities. So this first session is going to be interactive. So rather than me spouting on for the next 20 minutes about governance, which will be very boring, I thought we would look at some practical issues and also perhaps just to remind ourselves that governance isn't something that you can just put on the trustees' agenda and tick off as something that you've looked at. It does form a part of everything that all charities do. So hopefully you've seen, you've had a copy of the scenario. So Helen, if you could just put that up on the screen just to remind ourselves. We'll just get that up in a minute. Technical issue here. Oh, there we go. Right. So you may not be able to see that very much, but hopefully you have had a copy. And in the best Hollywood tradition, all of the facts are based on real live events, which I've been involved with, but only the names and the locations have been changed to protect the innocent. So welcome to the not so small town or village of Little Gooding, the population of 3,000 and the usual sort of community facilities, and in particular a village hall built just after the First World War and a community centre built in the 1960s. They both have fairly standard setups and are fairly typical of community venues of their type. And as we go through, I'll just put in a few extra facts. We may not be able to get through everything, but as I say, the information will be available after the seminar. We'll probably run a podcast on that as well. So, as I say, this is intended to be interactive, so please feel free to raise any points, and if you wish to do so, you will be able to unmute yourself. If you could just mention your name and the organisation that you're representing, that would be great. So the first point that I wanted to look at was concerning trustees. And first of all, who are the trustees for the purposes of charity and general law of both the village hall and the community centre? So just in case I can't see everybody, if you want to say anything, as I say, if you could just mention your name and any comments you want to make.
Duncan Wood.
Duncan, yeah.
I think obviously we've got 3 individual trustees listed under the village hall, 15 individual trustees listed under the community centre, but it also says property held by 3 individuals to the village hall. Those will be also be trustees, but they'll be holding trustees. So we're talking about 621 people involved as trustees.
Yes, that's correct. So obviously those people who are named as the trustees and who will be on the register at the charity commission, the 3 for the village hall and the 15 the committee of management for the community centre are all charity trustees. The land trustees, 3 in each case, as you say, in relation to the land and the buildings, will be treated as trustees. And in fact, anybody who is involved in the strategic issues relating to either centre could be a trustee, or somebody who holds themselves out as such could be treated as being a trustee. On the property side of things, if for the purposes of insurance, the land and the buildings should be insured in the names of those 3 individuals on behalf of the organisation that they represent, because they are the ones who are liable for the buildings themselves. Okay. So the second question is, what liability do you think the trustees might have in these particular scenarios? I'll give you a clue. So the individuals, because these are charitable trusts rather than something like a company or a charitable incorporated organisation, these are individuals who are jointly and severally liable. So jointly and severally liable means that they are individually and collectively liable for matters if things go wrong, basically, but also for entering into any contracts that involves the organisations. They will be in their names. that they will enter into those personally. So if somebody did want to make a claim, it would be against those people and they would be named as such. And also they would potentially be liable to the extent of their personal assets. Okay, so it's not just limited to the value of the village hall or the value of the community centre. It's those individuals' worth that is on the line, basically. So quite often trustees say, well, that's not a problem because we've covered that by insurance. And indeed, insurance is available, insurance for a whole variety of things, from property insurance to events insurance to all sorts of things, including the buildings. But quite often you find that insurance is done on an annual basis. Somebody's left to deal with the renewal. It's not always renewed correctly, and there are potential risks as a result. So in the case of the village hall, they run a garden fete every year for about 500 people. And they made sure that they contacted their insurers so that the bouncy castle that they were going to put in the grounds was covered. They got a permit for the additional car parking outside of their grounds. They got their music license and their bar license all sorted out. But on in the event, a child was injured when she was pushed to the ground by the crowd that was at the fete and broke her arm. So the trustees made a claim to their insurers, and the insurers originally refused to accept it. Now, why do you think that might be?
Duncan would. It would probably be around, or potentially be around, risk assessment, a recorded risk assessment for an event like that open to the public, and appropriate mitigation. So yeah, I mean, we all know insurance companies aren't overly fond of paying out, so give them a get out clause and they'll take it.
Yeah, and that's well, there were two reasons. The one that you mentioned, which is exactly right. The event had been run every year and had never been a problem, and so nobody had thought about what the risks might be. They had no formal register of what the risks might be. So when the insurance company asked them for that, they weren't able to provide anything. And that was a condition of their insurance policy when they were running events. And the second thing was that their insurance policy said that they were covered for events up to 100 people. And here, obviously, they had far more than that. And they hadn't gone to the insurers and asked for an extension, for which they probably have had to have paid an additional premium. So whilst insurance is available, just make sure that somebody looks at the policy, understands what's required, and in particular, risk assessments, which can be very dull but are hugely important, are carried out at the relevant time. So on the community centre, we've said—
You may not be able to see, but Sally Francis has got a hand up.
Oh, sorry, Sally.
Hi, you didn't mention third-party liability insurance there, but presumably they'd have quite a big sum covering that. Wouldn't that cover the situation with the child injured?
Well, again, the insurers said that the policy was there, but they hadn't complied with the conditions. So this wasn't to do with buildings insurance. This was a claim against their third-party insurance. But because they hadn't undertaken a proper risk assessment, they had nothing at all. It wasn't even as though somebody had a look at it. They just had assumed, because for the last 20 years they've been running a fete and it hadn't been a problem, that's all they needed to do. And insurers are very good at changing their conditions and rules throughout. So just beware of that, I think. In the case of the community centre, as I mentioned, it was built in the 1960s, and like a lot of buildings of that age, will probably have asbestos in it. And again, with the community centre, work was carried out, and they were drilling into the ceiling tiles, and one of the workmen was exposed to asbestos. Luckily, he was not badly injured. But all public buildings must have an asbestos risk register, which confirms whether or not they have got asbestos, if so, what type it is, and what they've done to protect that. And that can be removing it from the site altogether, which is pretty costly, or it may be just covering it up, but making sure that it is marked as such, so that if somebody comes to work at the building, then they know what they're dealing with. On the community centre, if you look at the number of trustees, so they've got 15 people who are involved, and one of those is the chief executive, rather grandly titled the chief executive or the administrator or whatever you want to call them. Do you think that that's okay to have the paid chief executive as a trustee?
Don't you have to have an express permission to have somebody who's paid on your trustees?
Yes, indeed. So up till quite recently, trustees were only allowed to be paid for expenses involved in being a trustee. And if they were receiving a salary, then they couldn't be a trustee at all. Those rules have been slightly changed, in that either you have to have a specific provision, or you need to change your constitution to include that. And there are some fairly stringent rules that the rest of the trustees have to go through to make sure that they can appoint somebody and pay them. And that includes looking at the market to see what other venues do, how much they pay chief executives, looking at their terms and conditions, looking at what sort of influence that person may have at trustees' meetings, and recording all of that so that if it's ever challenged, they have a proper note of what they have done. In general, it is better for paid employees not to be trustees, because there's inevitably a conflict. And it is better for them to be entitled to attend trustees' meeting and to speak at those, but not normally to vote. Again, with the community centre, we've got 15 people on the committee of management. Is that a realistic number to get decisions made? Do you think that's okay?
I think it's
A bit big.
A bit big.
Number.
Yeah. I think it's completely unwieldy, and in fact, that's what happened in one particular case. And more importantly, looking at the makeup of it, there are 8 people who represent groups that use the building. So that was a mixture of the toddlers group, the sports people who used it, and various others. And there were huge amounts of conflict as a result, in particular over things like the hiring charges, where everybody was fighting their own corner rather than looking at the best interests of the community centre. So I think generally that is really too many people. On the converse side, in the village hall, you've got 3 people, and those 3 people, in the particular case I'm thinking of, were fairly elderly. They were in their 80s, and therefore query how they were able to keep in touch with the community in terms of what they were putting on, what the hall was used for. So a balance, I think, between the two is what we should be looking for, and probably I would say 9 is the maximum you should have, depending on your particular circumstances. if you look at the
can I just raise about property holding trustees? Because we've got we've got a community field, and that's actually held by holding trustees. And I've come across it before where when it was set up, when it happened, some people stood forward and said, you can use my name. And although trustees come and go on the charity itself, those trust holding or property holding trustees, they just stay there. And sometimes they're in their 80s, or they may have even moved up to Birmingham or somewhere, and out of the loop completely. So that's something to watch out for, because you may want to actually make a decision, or if you incorporate, become a CIO or something, then you want that property to be held by your charity rather than outside of it.
Good, thank you for that. That preempted one of my next points. So thank you for that. Yes, it is often a huge problem, and in the particular case that I'm thinking of with the village hall, the trustees in that particular case, as you say, were all fairly elderly, and in fact had all died. So there were 3 individuals who had been appointed 30 or 40 years previously, who had quite an involvement with the charity, but as they got older, had less so, and nobody realised until somebody was looking to do some building works, and they needed to look at the title, that they suddenly realised that all 3 had passed away. And that caused a major problem, because in I don't want to get too technical about land issues, but where the last trustee has passed away, you have to try and find that person's executors. And they then have to enter into a document to appoint new trustees. So it's not the trustees of the charity, it's the executors of the land trustees who are involved in that. And that caused major problems. We had to get an inquiry agent to find out where the will was, where the executors lived, and then go to them and say, by the way, your great uncle so-and-so, who lived miles away from where you live, has passed away, and he was a charity trustee of the land. Will you now please enter into this deed? And of course, they hadn't a clue what was going on. So please do look at the trustees that are holding your land, and make sure that everything is in order, and that they are still with you, and still are contactable.
Nick, could I,
Yes.
Kate Christie from Thruxton,
Yeah.
could I possibly ask you to very briefly, if possible, explain what a land trustee is, because I've never come across that term before.
Okay, so where you have land held by a charity which is not incorporated, so it's not a company limited by guarantee, and it's not a charitable incorporated organisation, a CIO, the land has to be held by somebody, and it has to be held by individuals. So that's what would happen here. So they are holding the land on behalf of the village hall or the community centre. It doesn't mean that they can go off tomorrow and sell it and have a jolly good holiday. They are bound by the trust of the charity, but they basically are there and are the only people who can deal with the property. So they hold it on behalf of the trust. They are normally, there's normally 3 or 4 of them. And as I say, they hold it on behalf of the charity. And if any of them dies, it passes to the rest of them rather than to the charity. Hence why if you've got an issue where they're no longer around, then that's where the problem arises. Does that help?
Thank you.
Okay.
Could I just jump in really briefly?
Simon Wharton Rogate. Could you comment on our particular situation? where we have the land holding is in the name of the official custodian for charities. We are not an incorporated charity. We also have named trustees, but the land holding is in the name of the official custodian for charities, which means that, as I understand it, any transactions that that take place can be done so much more simply.
Yes, so the official custodian is a bit like, well, it is a holding trustee, but instead of individual people, it is actually by a quasi-government body, basically. So yes, if you wanted to do anything with the property, you would have to go to the official custodian, and he would then basically say yes or no.
Could I just jump in on that? That's all right. Yeah, I just put in the chat, folks who are following that might have seen the link to do that, what they call vesting in the official custodian for charities process that Simon's just talked about. And Nick, unless you know otherwise, I'm not aware of any reason why a village hall trust or an unincorporated community association wouldn't want to do that, because it takes away all of the issues that you might get that Nick has just explained about with holding trustees when they pass away or move away from the area. And again, as I understand it, brackets, I am not a solicitor, close brackets, the official custodian for charities doesn't interfere or intervene in any way beyond the Charity Commission's normal regulatory role. So I'm not aware of any disadvantage to going through that vesting in the official custodian process.
No, I think that's correct. I think it is the case that a lot of charities don't think about it until something happens, and then they need to look at their deeds and suddenly find that they haven't got people, and then they probably wish they had gone to the official custodian or indeed incorporated. So I think yes, the process is straightforward. They don't, as you say, they don't interfere. Some charities don't want to do that because they want to retain complete control, but in fact there isn't really any loss of control other than the fact that the deeds are held in the name of an external body. So yes, I would certainly recommend, but unless charities were thinking about going down an incorporated route, then that's what they should consider. Piers, have you got your hand up? I think you're on mute. No, he's gone. He's gone. Okay, we'll move on because I'm very conscious of time. We have gone slightly over. We've talked about the official custodian. Some charities, of course, also are looking at incorporation. I'm not going to talk very much about that. If anybody wants any further details of that, then I'm sure Kevin or I can provide those afterwards. And I think normally for village halls and community centres, the CIO model has been the version that has been used rather than the company limited by guarantee. But as I say, I'm very happy to talk about those or to give you information about those separately. I just wanted to, we haven't had a chance to go through everything. And I wanted to talk about the beneficiaries. And just very quickly on that, looking at the objects of both organisations, who the beneficiaries might be. So if you look at the case of the village hall, it's held on behalf of the inhabitants of Little Gooding, the area of benefit. And in the case of the community centre, it's held on behalf of the residents of Little Gooding and the neighbourhood. Okay, so in the case of the village hall, technically, only somebody living within the parish boundaries of Little Gooding can use the facilities. And that, or at least they are the people for whom the charity was set up. And in the case of the community centre, it's the same, but also extended to the neighbourhood, whatever that might be. So just look at what your objects are. and bear in mind the people who you are normally dealing with who use the facilities. So in the case of the community centre, we know that there is a football club which is based in the next county who has used the facilities and probably provides quite a bit of money to the community centre. So query whether that is permitted or not. I think in general, the occasional use by somebody who is out of the area of benefit is probably acceptable. But if it's a regular thing, you may want to consider changing the objects to widen them. And if you do so, that requires the consent of the Charity Commission. So just to note, just to check your objects to make sure you know exactly who it is that you are serving in the community.
Nick?
Yes.
Kate again, sorry. Could it not be argued that by letting your village hall to people who live outside the village, you're actually benefiting the people in the village because the hall is being used and its existence and has the money to remain?
I think it's a question of degree. If the football club is using the facilities on a regular basis to the exclusion of other local groups, then that's a problem. If they are using it and there is plenty of time for others to use it so that the football club's income can be used to expand the work of the community venue, then I think that's fine. I say it's a question of degree, really. And just to end up then, on the, we've mentioned that both organisations are in need of upgrading their buildings. Just to watch if you are making a public appeal for that, but you word it correctly. So in the case of the community centre, they published a document which said something along the lines of, please support our community centre. We need to raise £250,000 to improve the buildings. And that went out and they raised 100,000. And so they weren't able to complete the project. So they were then left with a dilemma as to what they could do with the £100,000 that they had got in. And in fact, they had to go to as many of the people that they could identify who had given them money to say, would you be happy for us to use it for some other purpose? And they managed to get most people, but not everybody. So they had to put notices in public places, the church, the local library, the post office, etc. But of course, each time they did that, they also had to go and say to the people, actually, we failed in what we were hoping to do, which wasn't very good PR. So I think the moral is, if you're going to have an appeal or a campaign to raise funds, make sure it is as widely worded as possible so that you don't get the situation either where you make too much money or not enough, and then have the situation of what do you think the wishes were of the people who gave you the money in the first place. We're well over time, so I'm going to have to move on. I hope you found that useful. But there were some other issues which I will put in a podcast and make available to everybody afterwards. But hopefully it did emphasize that governance isn't just something that you can discuss at a committee meeting. It is something that is involved with pretty well everything that charities are involved with, and is a living requirement rather than something that's rather dull and esoterical. So I say, hopefully that was helpful. And we're now going to move on to our next speaker, who is Andrew Wiltshire. Andrew is an associate with the employment team at Paris Smith and has a lot of experience advising charities on employment and related matters. But in addition to employment, which has been a key issue for charities, particularly over the last 2 years, There's also been an effect on those who volunteer and assist charitable organisations. And Andrew's talk is going to focus on the role of the volunteer. So Andrew, over to you.
Great, thank you, Nick, for that. Hello, everyone. It's good to be with you all this morning. And as Nick said, what I want to speak about this morning for 20 minutes or so is volunteers that you engage in your organisations. I'm sure many of you do deal with and engage with volunteers. And in terms of what I'm going to be focusing on, you'll see on the screen there, I want to look at employment status generally, and then move on to think about volunteering status and how that fits in with employment status. I then want to look at some of the potential risks around volunteers becoming either an employee or a worker, and I'll explain what those statuses mean. And then finally look at some practical tips and suggestions for your organisations to think about. And if you've got any questions, we do have a Q&A at the very end of today's webinar, so I will be very happy to take questions then. So Helen, next slide, please. Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to touch on employment status generally, and reason being that it's very topical. I'm sure many of you will have heard of the gig economy, meaning a labour market where freelance, temporary, independent contract work is common, and we are working in such an economy at the moment. And in 2016, the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy acknowledged that, and they launched an independent review, which later became known as the Taylor Review, due to the concerns around the gig economy and the impact on workers in the gig economy. And there's been some very recent cases with regards to workers in the gig economy. Many of you will have heard of the cases of Pimlico Plumbers, City Sprint, and Uber. And the most recent case went before the Supreme Court with regards to Uber in February of this year. And the Supreme Court handed down a landmark judgment, really, which confirmed that Uber drivers were indeed workers and not independent contractors, as Uber had argued. So really quite an important case there when we're looking at employment status. Next slide, please, Helen. So when it comes to employment status, there's three main categories. There's employees, there's workers, and a worker is a hybrid category between employee and self-employed. I'll explain a bit more about that shortly. And then you have the genuinely self-employed, so they have no employment status at all. Volunteers fall outside of those three categories, generally speaking, but I'll come on to how they can sometimes move into those categories. And the reason I want to speak about this today is that organisations who engage and host volunteers, first of all, need to be aware of their obligations towards them, but also when there's a potential risk that a volunteer could move in to a worker or an employment status. Next slide, please, Helen. And that's what I said there on the screen. When can a volunteer move from being purely a volunteer to either a worker with some employment rights or indeed to an employee with a whole host of employment rights? And the first question will be whether there is a contract in place. But the tribunal nowadays, following on from the case law, is far more concerned about the reality of the situation. What's happening on the ground? How is the individual operating within the business, the company, the charity, within the organisation? Because there may well be, let's say, for example, a volunteering agreement in place, or even a worker contract in place. But actually, the reality of the situation is that the organisation treats that individual as an employee, and the individual considers themselves to be integrated within the organisation and receives some kind of payment for being there. So I'll look at that shortly, but it's really important just to be aware initially that the tribunal is far more focused nowadays on the reality of the situation, even more than any written documentation in place. Next slide, please, Helen. So the very brief description of an employee is found in the Employment Rights Act, and that is an individual who is entered into or works under a contract to employment. So very brief and very unhelpful, actually. And as I say, that is only the starting point, and what happens in reality is far more important. Next slide, please, Helen. In a nutshell, though, an employee is someone who is paid in return for work, obviously. There's an intention to create a legally binding relationship. It doesn't have to be in writing, though, and the intention can be implied by conduct. And there is a payment, and that can be of minimal value, and it doesn't even need to be directly financial. So I will refer to some cases later on, but it could be, for example, expenses or some other value which passes between the organisation and the individual. So whether that be free entry or vouchers of some kind, it doesn't have to be a salary, for example. Next slide, please, Helen. And the reason that it's important to distinguish between employment status is that, of course, if an individual is deemed to be an employee, then they have the whole host of employment rights under statute. So they have the right to not be unfairly dismissed. They have obviously rights to receive the minimum wage or the living wage. The full host of parental rights are available to them, and they cannot be discriminated against as well. So when you're dealing with an employee, they have the whole host of employment rights available to them. Next slide, please, Helen. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the contract or written documentation in place that you have with an individual, volunteer, an employee, or a worker, is only the starting point. These are the factors that the tribunal will be more focused on. If you've got an individual who, let's say, is a volunteer, but they actually say, well, I think I'm actually an employee, or I think I'm a worker. These are the factors on the screen here that the tribunal will be more concerned with, and they will go through these factors in turn. So personal service is really important, and other than in very limited circumstances, an employee is required to provide their personal service, whereas a self-employed individual would be able to provide a substitute or subcontract that work, whereas an employee would have to provide that work personally. Pay, so of course, an employee would expect to receive a salary or some other financial benefit, whereas a self-employed individual would submit invoices for the work that they do and expect to receive a fee for that work. Mutuality of obligation, that is where there's an obligation on the employer to provide work for that person, and there's an obligation on the individual to accept that work. In an employment relationship, there is always mutuality of obligation. Control, well, that includes the power of deciding what is to be done, the way in which it shall be done, the means in which it shall be done, and the time and the place in which it shall be done. And in an employment relationship, the employer has complete control over all of those factors. In a self-employed relationship, there is no control to that extent. Equipment is another factor that the tribunal will look at. Does the individual provide their own equipment, or does the organisation provide the equipment that they use? It could be a car, it could be a computer, it could be tools, for example. Who provides the equipment? Integration is another factor, and the degree of integration into an employer or an organisation's business is another factor that the tribunal will take into account. Do they wear company t-shirts? Are they invited to staff socials and parties, etc.? That's just another factor that the tribunal will take into account. And they want to paint a picture, really, as to this individual. Are they self-employed? Are they a worker? Are they an employee? Or indeed, are they simply just a volunteer? Next slide, please, Helen. So that was an employee. What's a worker? And as I've said already, a worker is a hybrid category really, and it's a fairly grey definition. But what we do know is that it's either someone who works under a contract of employment, so all employees will be workers, or is someone who works under any other contract, whether express or implied, where the individual is to perform the service or work personally. So we have that personal service requirement again, but not as a client or customer of a profession or business. Next slide, please, Helen. So importantly, workers have some protection, but not all that an employee would have. So what are they entitled to? Well, they'd be entitled to holiday pay. They'd be entitled to the rights under the working time regulations. And importantly, they're also protected from discrimination law under the Equality Act 2010. And that's quite a significant protection. It would be a day one right. So it would mean protection from direct discrimination, direct harassment, victimization, and so forth. They're not entitled to, importantly, unfair dismissal. So they can't be unfairly dismissed. And they're also not entitled to maternity rights and protections as an employee would be. So there's some protection there and some significant protection, but they don't have all the rights and protections that an employee would have. Next slide, please, Helen. So the factors that a tribunal will take into account when thinking about worker status will first and foremost be, is there a contract in place? Because an individual can't be a worker unless there's a contract in place. And that doesn't have to be a written contract, as I've said. It doesn't mean that if an organisation hasn't got a written contract, then the individual can't claim they're a worker. It could be an implied contract taken by conduct over time. But if there is no contract in place, either express or implied, then a tribunal will not be able to find that they are a worker. There has to be personal service. Again, as I've said, the tribunal will generally look at that through the lens of whether that individual could provide a substitute or whether they could work. Business undertaking, I'm not going to spend too much time on that today, but that's generally whether the other party for the contract is not the customer or client of a business undertaking or profession. A mutuality of obligation, again, I've mentioned that already. Is there an obligation on the organisation to provide the work? Is there an obligation on the individual to do the work? And if there isn't, then it moves away from employment and worker status more towards self-employed or indeed volunteer status. So those are the factors, the kind of myriad of considerations that a tribunal will look at for worker status. Next slide, please, Helen. And finally, we have the self-employed, the genuinely self-employed who are in business on their own account. It's governed by a commercial contract, and normal contractual principles will apply to that. And generally, that will be someone servicing a client or a customer. And for the genuinely self-employed, there will be no employment rights associated with that relationship. Next slide, please, Helen. So I wanted to give a bit of context to employment status before turning to volunteering, because it's helpful to understand where volunteering sits within the three types of employment status. And somewhat unhelpfully, there is no single statutory definition of what a volunteer is. The best that we actually have is found in the Police Act 1997, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And it defines a volunteer as, if you could put the next slide on, Helen, the definition of a volunteer is a person engaged in an activity which involves spending time, unpaid, except for travel or other out-of-pocket expenses, doing something which aims to benefit some third party other than or in addition to a close relative. So that's the definition that we have in the Police Act. Next slide, please, Helen. So in summary, it seems to be that a volunteer is someone who spends time, unpaid, engaged in an activity which is for the benefit of third party. Next slide, please, Helen. So the legal status, as I've touched on already, is important for a number of reasons, but fundamentally it determines the extent of any employment rights that they may have. And the legal status of volunteers and interns, which is very similar, is not clear cut. It's quite a grey area. And the key question really is it a voluntary relationship or has it turned into a contractual relationship? And of course, tribunals will look at case law when thinking about that. And that's, of course, a key question for you and your organisations. Next slide, please, Helen. If an individual is purely a volunteer, then there will be no statutory employment rights attached to that relationship. And there will be no protection from discrimination law either. That will be if they are purely a volunteer and they haven't crossed over to being a worker or an employee. Next slide, please, Helen. And in terms of when we're thinking about whether there has been a crossover, what we need to think about, first of all, is when we're talking about worker status, is there a contract? And I don't want to get bogged down in the ins and outs of contract law, But just to give you a brief overview of what we're thinking about, because as I've said already, to establish protection under any of the three categories, an individual must first establish that they have a contract with an organisation. If you could put the next slide on, Helen, I just want to think about what those key elements are. There has to be an offer, there has to be an acceptance of that offer, there has to be consideration passing between the parties, and there has to be an intention to create legal relations. And if an individual can't establish those four facts, then there will not be a contract in place, and that will be fatal to any claim, either under the Employment Rights Act or the Equalities Act 2010 to worker or employment status. Next slide, please, Helen. A volunteer will only be able to be paid minimum wage if they're deemed to be a worker. So if they can establish that there is a contract in place, then they may well be entitled to national minimum wage. And as I've said there, if there's no contract in place, there's no financial remuneration or benefits which will constitute consideration, then that will fail. The minimum wage would be an entitlement if they're deemed to be workers, otherwise it would not be. Next slide, please, Helen. And similarly, for holiday pay, if a volunteer is a worker, they'd be entitled to be paid holiday under the working time regulations. Now, I just wanted to touch on a case which I think is very helpful here when trying to ground this. There was a case where an individual worked for an organisation as a volunteer, or as the organisation thought, 4 mornings a week, and she was paid volunteers' expenses of £25 a week, which actually later increased to £40 a week, even though she incurred no expenses. But she was paid expenses regardless of whether she actually incurred them. And interestingly, she was also paid expenses when she was on holiday or even when she was sick. She brought a claim saying that she was an employee and that she'd been discriminated against. It went to the tribunal and they agreed with her that she was actually an employee. She appealed to the Employment Appeals Tribunal, and they also agreed with the tribunal that she was an employee for employment status purposes. They said that the payment of expenses was clearly payment for work and was not reimbursement, and upheld the tribunal's decision, and therefore she was able to pursue her claims for unfair discrimination. And the key point there is, of course, with regards to expenses, she was paid them regardless of whether she incurred them or not, and she was paid them when she was on holiday and on sick leave. So it was clearly payment for work rather than just expenses. So just something to be aware of there if you pay expenses to your volunteers. Next slide, please, Helen. So importantly, why am I touching on this today? And it comes down to what's the risk of getting this wrong. And of course, if you engage with a volunteer who's been with you for many years, who works for you 3-4 days a week, same hours, is very integrated in the organisation, you do just need to think about that. Because if they were to turn around and say, well, actually, I'm an employee or a worker, and they brought a claim, then they may well be able to receive an award by the tribunal. That could be a financial award, a compensation award, and there's also legal costs involved, of course, in defending that claim, and that can be costly, and it's a long, drawn-out process in the tribunal. And not to be underestimated is the management time involved in the tribunal claim. Significant. We're often finding the tribunal claims stretch over 12 to 18 months now. And of course, there's reputational damage to think about as well. So it is important to think about and evaluate the volunteers and how you deal with and engage with them to avoid these situations boiling up in the future. Next slide, please, Helen. And finally, I just wanted to touch on some practical tips for you and your organisation in reducing the risk of this being an issue. And the first of those is with regards to the case that I referred to, is avoid payments to your volunteers, but just pay actual expenses only, which have been incurred. So payments to cover actual expenses, and they should be clearly identified as such. And ideally, they would be reimbursed against receipts from the individual. If you get into a situation where you're paying expenses or other payments habitually, then there could be an argument that it's payment for work. Remove or at least minimise any perks which could be seen as consideration, which goes into the argument of whether there is a contract in existence for work status. And think about reducing obligations on the part of the volunteer. If you have had a volunteer who's been engaged in the organisation for years and years, they've probably taken on more and more responsibilities. So you just need to think about whether there could be a risk there, whether you want to reduce the obligations and the tasks that they do. And give the volunteer an opportunity to refuse tasks and choose when to work. That comes back to the control element, the mutuality of obligation. Make sure that you're not exercising too much control, and make sure that the volunteer is able to say no, they can't work, if that's the case. Next slide, please, Helen. Importantly, avoid contractual language and adopt flexible language, such as, this is what we would usually expect, or this is our suggested approach, rather than this is what you must do and this is what you shall be obligated to do. And treat them fairly. I think that goes without saying, really, because you don't want situations where volunteers are treated differently to your employees, and there could be an opening for a discrimination or a constructive unfair dismissal claim. And finally, next slide, please, Helen, is think about having a volunteer agreement. I've said on the screen there, they are still a good idea. I don't know how many organisations still use them, but I would still recommend the use of them. They should be carefully drafted and followed so that managers can understand them. But they are very helpful, I think, in just setting out the organisation's commitment to its volunteers. Next slide, please, Helen. And what they hope that the volunteer relationship will include. So it could include the volunteer's role, induction and training, supervision, support, flexibility. Next slide, please, Helen. How expenses will be treated, insurances, and health and safety. So it doesn't have to be a long document, and it's not the be-all and end-all when it comes to employment status, but I think it still has a role to play. And finally, some organisations also, on top of that, have a volunteer policy, which again provides more details and a framework for their volunteers to work within, which sets out some more detailed principles. So that's all I wanted to say on volunteers this morning. I hope that's been helpful in terms of just outlining employment status and where volunteers sit within that, and some tips for you to think about if there may be some individuals who you think actually there could be a slight risk there. Hopefully there's some practical tips there for you to take away and think about for your organisation. Happy to take questions at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for steering us through the minefield that is employment law. So thank you very much for that. So our next speaker, I'm delighted that Sally Arscott is able to be with us. Sally is the Development Director for YMCA Fairthorne Group, one of the largest YMCAs in the country. She's been with them since 2006 and most recently led on the opening of the new YMCA Community Centre, Cafe and Nursery at North Stoneham Park in Eastleigh. She is involved in building strategic partnerships with local authorities, housing developers and the voluntary sector, ensuring that buildings are effective, as well as providing long-term sustainable centres. And Sally is going to talk today about building communities. So Sally, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for that kind introduction. So as Nick explained, I'm hoping today to talk a little bit more about our approach to building community, which of course is a deliberate pun on the spin of the word community building, because we see community buildings as so integral into how communities can become vibrant and cohesive. And it's just about setting that scene properly in our minds and having an organisation, be it the local trustee base that Nick's talked about earlier in his presentation, or another organisation able to foster some of the huge added value that community buildings can bring. So we've only got about 15 minutes this morning, so we'll do a bit of a whistle-top tour about our approach and how we do things. But I'm really hoping that as we speak, you'll be able to draw from our approach things that you might take to your own community buildings as appropriate. Helen, next slide, please. Bit of the background to us. I'm sure many of you have heard the name YMCA. but we're all slightly different up and down the country, and we've been going a long time and have evolved as we go. So we're a federated organisation. There is a YMCA in almost every local authority area of the country, and indeed in every country of the world. But we as YMCA Fairthorne Group are based in Hampshire, Southampton, Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight. So we are an independent charity as YMCA Fairthorne Group, but affiliate to our colleagues up and down the country. We are very much a community charity. We focus on working in discrete communities and responding to the needs that we understand from that community, and work with people of all ages to have a real sort of cradle to grave approach, all the way through our early years provision, all the way up to working with older people and all ages in between. And we work with about 40,000 people each year. And so we have a whole range of buildings in which we do that. Some are purely early years settings, and as I note here, we've got 18 of those. But we have a number of other buildings that have a much broader community offer and serve that full age range. So hopefully some things of what we have learned and developed through our experience might bring some value to your own situations. Helen, next slide, please. So our purpose as an organisation is that everyone should lead a happy, healthy life. So a very broad purpose, but it is based on the fact that we deliver in communities and really want to respond to the way in which people will want to lead happy, healthy lives in their own community. And we recognise that that changes place by place. Helen, next slide. So our fundamental approach to delivering that purpose is to, as I say, work with people of all ages and backgrounds. So we tend to have both universal and targeted services to allow us to work with people regardless of their level of need and regardless of their age. We have places. We think that's really important, that there is a welcoming place in the community for people to come together, and we run programs from those places. So there's always something going on. So our community buildings are bringing people, places and programs together, so that we have something that's always happening and can be the focal point of a community. Helen, next slide, please. So a phrase I heard someone else use recently, but I've decided to adopt it as a phrase myself, which is that kids and coffee are now at the heart of every community. In too many situations, you have community centres which are predominantly closed and waiting to be hired. Our view is that actually, if we want to really contribute towards a thriving community, we need to have those buildings open. And the way in which we open our buildings is to have provision for kids and for coffee, to use the slang there, to bring people in. And out of that, the rest of our services follow. So in all of our centres, we create a whole raft of programmes which are going on to allow people to access provision that works for them. But a critical part is having a nursery within the footprint of the building. That for us has achieved huge impact in terms of that early years provision on our youngest children, but also delivers a sustainable income stream. Community buildings are not cheap. We've talked a little bit about insurances earlier on. We talked a little bit about employees. All those costs need to be met. And if you're relying purely on higher income, that makes it quite volatile. So from our perspective, we always put a nursery within a wing of the building to ensure we have sustainable income stream and a broadly stable income stream. But we recognise that the changing childcare market means that those nurseries need to be at scale. The days when a small preschool can sustain a whole building have now gone, unfortunately. So from our perspective, we always have a nursery of at least 80 places within a wing of our community buildings to provide that income stream, but also to provide a continuous footfall into the building. Parents are coming each and every morning and evening to collect their children, and that gives you the opportunity to have those interactions, find out what people need, and signpost parents into other services that might be running into the building. So we have this single front door approach where you come in and access all services through one door, but turn to various aspects of the building to meet the help that you need. And the cafe, of course, is often at the entrance of the building, allowing people to meet people as they arrive, and then they turn off to whether it be the nursery or the community spaces. Helen, next slide, please. So for us, like a YMCA community branch or a community building has as an entrance, as I just alluded to, a cafe or some sort of service that is open to anyone and everyone, and that people feel they can always walk in through the door. Sometimes we have libraries as our entrance area, and we've talked about other services too, like GP surgeries and elsewhere, but the cafe is a traditional model, and people understand that and understand that they can come in and be welcomed. So that's our typical sort of thing that's at the entrance. And then we have a range of other spaces. I've talked about the childcare being in a wing of the building, but we also feel it's really important to have youth spaces. Too many young people are not really allowed into community centres anymore, and yet they're an important part of our community. So we typically provide a youth space, and then a range of multi-purpose community spaces for exercise classes, for adult learning, for support groups to take place. So rooms of different sizes and proportions to meet a whole range of needs. And then we have a commercial kitchen in there as well, which works for us because, of course, our catering team are catering for our nursery, our cafe, and then, of course, any community programs that might want food, be it children's birthday parties, adult birthday parties, or different events. So the commercial kitchen for us is another important part of the building. And then alongside our resources and facilities, we may have other facilities too, like extra care for the elderly. I mentioned briefly GP spaces, which again are kind of opportunities for us to meet different parts of the community and for them to access the programs that we're running. So our buildings are usually owned and funded and operated by us, but we work with a whole range of organisations to deliver different services. It would be impossible for one organisation to meet the needs of every community. Indeed, our priority is that we provide the place, and many other partners and organisations will support with us and work alongside us to deliver relevant programmes. When we've understood a community and we recognise that there is a need that they've expressed, we'll then initiate a programme and identify a partner that will be best placed to meet that need. Be, as I say, an exercise class if everybody wants Zumba, or if indeed people are wanting sort of support networks or parenting classes or whatever need that might be, we will go out and find an organisation that can deliver it. But fundamentally, we are carrying the risk of operating the community building and all of those liabilities that go with that. We operate and manage those risks. Helen, next slide, please. So in many cases, we build the buildings ourselves. That's not an exclusive thing that we would do. We take on many existing buildings, and of our existing portfolio of property, many have come in very different ways. But in the introduction, Nick mentioned that we've just opened a building in Eastleigh, and that went through this process where we built and designed the building. But we're open to all models. We're not about property, we're about delivery. But in that particular case, we worked with the developer at Eastleigh and elsewhere where we've done this to design the centre. And we bring our experience in community centre design, but also nursery design. And we have quite a clear model, as I'm guessing you might now have recognised, so that we can lay out the building in a way that we think will work and encourage the community to come into the building, but also to access the various services. So we've identified the plot of land, we're working with developers and the architects to design it, and then we get it built. In some cases, in new communities, we can access Section 106 funding to finance the build. That's not always the case, but where we can, of course, we'd prefer it if the developer pays for it, for the community building, and then we will top that up as we need to, particularly for the nursery element, which is rarely included as part of any sort of developer obligations. But typically, if there isn't a development of the scale that triggers what's called a Section 106, which is a large obligation, in other cases, if there's just a handful of houses being built, a developer might still need to contribute some form of community funding. And there's usually a funding application process to the local authority to access that. So the SIL grants, as you may have come across them, are for community investment levy, and community infrastructure levy. And we've accessed that, as indeed many of you may have done as well, to provide community resources out of the community building. And that can be another source of funding to get buildings underway. I mentioned that we will either acquire the land and manage the construction process, or indeed a developer might build as a turnkey facility. That's less relevant for us. It's important that the building works, but we're not precious about how it comes to be, because our main remit is around operating the building and working with partners to meet those community needs. Helen, next slide, please. So the way in which we fund our buildings, our community buildings, is, as I've alluded to, through the nursery. Yes, that income is then topped up with income from a cafe or income from hire of the space, but we recognise the volatility of those sources of income, and taking on a liability of a new building, we feel that's too high a risk just to rely on those sources, and hence we include the nursery part of it. I say 95 places here. I think a moment ago in my presentation I mentioned 80. It's somewhere in the middle. It kind of depends on what sort of level of fees you can charge, and the proportion of our parents who are indeed paying fees or accessing government funded places. Because of course government funding places are still very important to us. Ensuring every parent who wants early years childcare can access it is important to us. But of course, we recognise that traditionally a lot of community buildings have had a preschool as its anchor tenant in the village hall. But the model for funding those is becoming very tricky. Government funding per child per hour is so low now that you need scale to make it work. So a small preschool in a village hall is often very tricky to run. But that same principle of having preschool and nursery care in the centre of a community building still holds true. It's just about having many, many more places now to make certain the income stacks up. So that forms the economic underpinning of the building, as it were. That income from the nursery not only funds the community, the nursery part, but it entirely funds the community building. It keeps the lights on, as it were, pays utility bills, pays the costs of running that building, but it also pays for a community worker to go out into the community and understand the needs and generate and initiate programs to meet those needs. And then, of course, on top of that, we access grants. As a charity, we can access a whole raft of grants to deliver specific community programs. So where our community worker may go out and discover that actually what this community really wants is employment advice or training or particular type of need, we can then seek a grant to access that if we can't fund it ourselves. But what we have is a sustainable income stream through the nursery that allows the building to always be open, even if the programs that it runs from within it may change over time. Next slide, Helen. So we think we're quite unique in that ability to run those cradle to grave programs from a community building, to be able to deliver early years provision all the way through to school age programs, youth programs, family services, and then resources for older populations. But we're very much a purpose-driven organisation which is focused on meeting those community needs and recognise that all parts of the community are welcome at the YMCA. We very much operate as a social enterprise, so we generate our own income. We're not reliant on grants, though of course we seek those too. And we are able to access finance to build our own community buildings. We're continually reviewing new communities for YMCA to operate in. So whilst many cases we seek to be in new build communities where that we know there is a guaranteed audience for a nursery and developer contributions to finance the build, we're also looking at existing communities where there is a need for us to operate a community building, assuming that approach that I've outlined works. So it's a model which potentially other organisations would happily adopt or could talk to us if they wanted to bring the YMCA into their own community building. Helen, next slide, please. And what I've got here now is just some photographs, just to give you a feel for some of the community facilities that we run. These pictures here are all from our new centre in Eastleigh, and you can see here the cafe at the entrance and a Zumba class going on in the main hall, as well as the outside. We scroll down to the next slide, you'll see our site in Andover, again, has this welcoming entrance area. There isn't a formal cafe there, but there is a facility for people to make drinks and for people to just walk in and meet friends and have social interactions. But then leading into the nurseries, you can see a picture there of the nursery and the outside of the building again. And then the final slide I have, is a library that we run. So slightly different. The nursery is actually about a mile away, but from an income perspective, the two join up. But also from a community perspective, we regularly see our parents between the two settings. And whilst a library you might not feel is the focal point for community activity, the way we run this library very much is. So there's parent toddler groups, there's youth sessions, there's after school drop-in, and lots of advice and support for people as they walk through the door. And if they happen to borrow a book along the way, so much the better. But it is about making a building vibrant and supporting the community in which it is located, so that it genuinely is a centre at the heart of a community, rather than a desolate centre that people can't access. So that real sense of we need to put programme on to make these buildings vibrant and a place where people can come in and access support. That's all I wanted to share with you. I was conscious of time, and I think I've stuck to broadly to my 15 minutes. So I hope that to be the case. But happy to take questions at the end when we come to those at the end of the webinar. So thank you for that.
Sally, thank you very much, and thank you for explaining a bit more about the YMCA model and how it works in the local communities. That was great. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Ryan Mitchell. Ryan's been recently appointed as an associate at Harris Smith, working in the commercial team, particularly specialising in GDPR, commercial contracts and similar matters. He acts for a number of charities, in particular on governance issues, but today is giving us an update and overview on GDPR and how it affects charities. So Ryan, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. So I thought it'd be helpful just to start with what I did in preparation for this session to give you an idea of where I'm coming from. So what I did was I went out onto the internet and I looked at all of the websites, social media profiles, web presences I could find of village halls and community centres. And what I found might not be surprising to people here today. It was that the vast majority of village halls didn't have any privacy policies, and that many community centres either didn't have privacy policies or their policies didn't meet all of the relevant requirements. So what that tells me as a data protection lawyer is that I expect that quite a few people here today are coming from organisations that aren't compliant or are almost compliant but need a little bit of help getting over that final hurdle. So I've therefore written today's session to be a very practical overview of what your compliance obligations are and how your organisation can become compliant, or if you think you are already compliant, check your compliance. And the important thing is that I'm giving that guidance for you to do it in a way that doesn't involve spending money on legal fees. So if we go to our first slide, please, Helen. Let's get some key terms out of the way first of all. You can all breathe a sigh of relief because this isn't going to be a really technical session this afternoon, but it is important that we all have an understanding of some key terms. So today we're of course talking about data protection, and that means the laws and regulations relating to the processing of personal data. So what do we mean by personal data? Well, the test for whether a piece of information is personal data is, does it identify a living individual? So there's two ways in which information can identify a living individual. It could be directly identifying, and this is where the information itself is obviously identifying of a person. So let's say my name, Ryan Mitchell, or a photograph of me. It's obvious who the person is from that information. The second type is indirectly identifying information. And this is where you can combine different types of information together to work out who the person is. So I can demonstrate that with an example. So let's say that you're given just the address and the age of one of your colleagues. You can probably work out with reasonable accuracy who that person might be. In which case, in that context, their age and their address is personal data because you can use it to indirectly identify the person even though you don't have their name. So what are the main sources of law in the UK relating to data protection? Well, I've got them up on the slide. They are the UK General Data Protection Regulation, also known as the UK GDPR, and the Data Protection Act 2018, which we sometimes call the DPA or DPA 2018. Now, what do these two pieces of legislation have in common? Well, they're both very long, They're both very technical and they're both quite difficult to read for the most part. So my advice to you as a lawyer is don't read the law unless you have to. Instead, there's a fantastic wealth of resources on the ICO website, which is www.ico.org.uk. What is the ICO? The ICO, as you hopefully are aware, is the UK data protection regulator. And as we'll come on to, reading the guidance on the ICO website is a fantastic starting point for your compliance. So if we go over to our next slide, we've got a really key question here, and it is, why? Why bother? Ryan, why should we even care about being compliant? And it's a really good question. I appreciate, and data protection lawyers have to understand, that your resources are already strained and you're really having to choose carefully about what you prioritise your time and money on. We've got to be realistic. Compliance isn't about getting a warm, fuzzy feeling, knowing that you're doing the right thing. Rather, it's driven by practical considerations. And I've identified what I think the three main ones should be for village halls and community centres. So I've got these up on the slide. They are in order: prevention, protection, and what I like to call hidden benefits. And this is the idea that there are other positive benefits from being compliant that you might not have thought about. Now, I'm going to come on to each of these in turn, but I think it's really important at this point that I explain and make the point that data protection law does not contain any compliance exemptions for small organisations. Even if you're a really small organisation of just a handful of people, if you're processing personal data, then the law says you need to be compliant. So let's take a look at each of these reasons for compliance in turn on the next slide. So first of all, prevention. And this is the idea that if you've got good policies and procedures in place, and I'll come on to how to achieve that, and it's backed by staff training, then it's less likely that something will go wrong in the first place, and it's less likely the organisation will receive a complaint or that somebody will complain to the ICO, the regulator, if something does go wrong. Next up on the next slide is the idea of protection being a really important point for being compliant. This is the idea that being compliant protects your organisation if things do go wrong, if the unfortunate does happen, and it's fairly common. So, for example, you can mitigate the impact of a data breach by following your data breach procedure to quickly address the issue, and we'll come on to what data breaches are. You might have really good IT procedures that allow you to quickly contain a hack on your system or a ransomware attack from spreading between your different databases. If you have policies which clearly tell staff what they can and can't do with your organisation's personal data, then it's easier for your organisation to argue that it's not responsible for a staff member who deliberately misuses or steals that data. And I'll come on to a practical example of that later. Basically, if you're following this reasoning, your argument to the regulator would be, they knew what they were doing was wrong, and we've done everything we reasonably could to prevent that from happening. And the third point is that the regulator, the ICO, they're more lenient if you can show that you've suffered an incident despite having good written policies and procedures in place. What does that mean? Well, you might avoid a public telling off. If it's quite a serious breach, you might even avoid a fine. So all these points on protection being a great reason to be compliant boil down to your organisation will face less harsh consequences if you do spend the time being compliant than if you hadn't bothered, basically. And then if we go on to the next slide, we've then got hidden benefits, as I like to call them. So these are benefits to being compliant that won't be at the forefront of your mind. I mean, admittedly, they're not as important as avoiding fines, avoiding bad publicity, but hopefully after me talking through them, they will factor into your decision-making, hopefully to be budgeting sufficient time and resources on data protection compliance. So what are they? What are the hidden benefits? Well, first of all, stress reduction. Knowing your organisation is compliant means you aren't worried about being found out. So for example, let's say you've got a procedure in place for dealing with subject access requests. So for those of you who aren't familiar, subject access request is whereby somebody asks to receive copies of the personal data that you hold about them. If you've got that policy in place, then there's no need to panic if you receive one, you just simply follow the procedure. Second point, staff training on data protection can help build transferable skills. And a good training program can actually be seen as a benefit of working or volunteering for your organisation. More senior staff might even seek to get a certification which is paid for by your organisation. And this can make your organisation a more attractive place to work, and it can help if you're struggling to recruit or retain staff or volunteers. And the final point, which is quite an important one, is that clubs, societies, groups, your customers, they've got their own compliance obligations as well. And if they take these seriously, then they're likely to expect that you should do so as well, particularly if they're sharing personal data with you. So examples of that could be if they share attendance lists with you, or details about attendees' physical disabilities or accessibility requirements, or maybe allergies that it might be relevant for your resident first aider to be aware of. If you can't show that you're compliant, then you might actually be missing out on business because they feel like they can't work with you and they're going elsewhere for different places, facilities. So let's turn over to our next slide. When can it go wrong? What do we mean when we get data protection issues? So the first example that always springs to mind, I think, is the idea of data breaches. And the big data breaches, they tend to make the headlines in the national papers. So I've included here the official ICO definition of what a data breach is. And it is a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data. So what does that mean in practical terms? Well, it means that a data breach can be deliberate or unintentional, but it usually involves the loss of control of personal data in some way. And I've got an example here. So let's say your organization has a monthly newsletter, a monthly email newsletter. And what you normally do, as is best practice, is before you send out, you put all the recipients in the BCC field. So when they receive it, they can't see who else receives the newsletter. But let's say you've got a new member of staff and they don't do that. All of the recipients of that email newsletter can see everyone else's email addresses. And this is actually technically a data breach. And if we reflect back on the ICO wording, it's a breach because there's an accidental, unauthorized disclosure of everybody's email addresses to everybody else on that list. Those email addresses are likely to be personal data as well. So even though that's a breach, these types of breaches are usually minor, but that's not always the case. So let's think, for example, if the email was about, say, an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting or a trauma support group. Accidentally sharing details of the attendees for those types of meetings could be very distressing for those people involved. And I think the classic example of a data breach is, for example, someone leaving an important confidential file or a laptop on a train, or a computer hack, or as we're increasingly seeing, ransomware attacks where your entire system gets encrypted and you lose access to it. So let's go over to the next slide. And I've got a few more examples about where things can go wrong that aren't necessarily related to data breaches. So it's worth remembering at this point that data protection law is just basically a series of rules. And if you don't follow those rules, then technically it's a breach of the law and you are non-compliant. Now, the reality is that I would probably say the vast majority of instances of non-compliance don't result in the regulator taking action. The regulator might not ever hear about it. It never leaves the four walls of a board meeting, for example, or a trustee meeting. The instances of non-compliance that do tend to result in regulator action tend to fall within one of two categories. The first is that the non-compliance has caused some other tangible impact on the people whose data you're processing. So this could be distress, it could be them being at risk of financial fraud because you've lost their payment details, that kind of thing. The second category where the regulator tends to take action is because the non-compliance has affected lots of people. And this tends to be the reasoning we see behind the fines that make the news for prolific nuisance callers, email spammers, etc. Now, if you're a village hall or community centre, you probably don't have tens of thousands of people that you're reaching out to every month, but it is still worth being mindful of that possibility if you're contacting people without having lawful grounds to do so. So let's think again of some practical examples of where things could go wrong due to not having good procedures or documentation. And these are based on real world examples. So firstly, let's say a member of your staff photographs a children's football practice at your facilities, and they post the photograph on your organisation's Facebook page. Maybe they do it to promote the club itself or just to promote your wider facilities. They don't think to check what procedures you have in place they should have read before doing that, or perhaps you don't even have any procedures regarding photographing children. So data protection law says you might not actually be allowed to process the children's personal data in this way. So remember that processing and sharing their image in the form of a photograph is a form of data processing. And because it's children, the non-compliance could have safeguarding issues as well as being a breach of data protection law. So for example, maybe an estranged relative is able to identify and track down a child based on social media postings. Another example, let's say that a member of staff looks up the phone number of a fitness instructor who hosts classes at your facilities. The staff member texts the fitness instructor from their personal phone and they ask if they want to go on a date. Now, data protection law quite rightly says that phone number wasn't collected by your organisation for that purpose and therefore shouldn't be used in that way. The member of staff's actions are a breach of data protection law. And putting ourselves in the shoes of the fitness instructor, obviously it's very unprofessional to be approached in that way. It could be quite unnerving if they feel like their data isn't being protected within your organisation. That could lead to a complaint to your organisation, could lead to a complaint to the regulator, the ICO. If you don't have a policy telling staff that they're not allowed to use personal data for their personal purposes, even though you and I know it's common sense not to do that, then the regulator might come back and go, well, you're partially responsible because you don't have a policy telling them you shouldn't be doing that. So we focused on how it can go wrong. Let's focus on something positive now on the next slide, which is how we can be compliant. And this is a very brief guide. This is probably the shortest data protection guide you will ever read, with a grand total of 3 action points. So let's take them in turn. Number 1, if you haven't already, consider appointing someone within your organisation to lead data protection compliance. And this could be, but doesn't have to be, the appointment of a formal data protection officer, or DPO. I should stress that this person isn't solely responsible for ensuring the organisation complies with the law. Don't leave them high and dry. You are meant to be supporting them. Compliance is a collective responsibility at all levels of your organisation. I would also say it's a good idea for this person to have some sort of formal training on data protection to help them out. Second point, read and follow the ICO guidance. Get a copy, work through it, potentially over a number of days, maybe even a number of weeks. You don't have to read absolutely everything initially. Identify which sections are relevant to your organisation and go from there. If you do get really stuck, if you're feeling overwhelmed, a good starting point is the list of 7 data protection principles. And these underpin all of the other data protection rules, basically. If you've read the guidance in the past, particularly when GDPR first came out, mid-2018, then I'd recommend still going back and having another look at it, particularly because the guidance has really improved in the last couple of years. And you may find that where there was previously lots of gaps, there's now very clear guidance and worked examples of how to be compliant. And what if you've got specific questions about how the law applies to your organisation? Well, actually, you can contact the ICO. You can give them a call on their hotline, or you can use the live chat function to send them a message and hopefully speak to someone who can guide you through being compliant. Point number 3, and the final point on my very brief guide, is documenting your data processing. So documenting the activities you do within your organisation which relate to personal data. And there's 2 prongs to this. So the first prong is documenting your internal procedures which relate to personal data. And the second prong is producing and maintaining specific compliance documents that the law says you must have. And in the coming slides, I'm going to go through both of those points. So if we go to the next one. On this slide, I've given you examples of procedures within your organisation that relate to personal data that I recommend you document. First of all, why should we do that? Well, if the ICO comes knocking, if you are investigated, then having these documents shows the ICO that you are compliant, because you can demonstrate your compliance through these written policies and processes. Also, these documents help you to react quickly to certain data protection issues. And you might remember I mentioned the example earlier of a subject access request. So if you've got a procedure in place for responding to it, you can hit the ground running. And there are strict legal timeframes for lots of data protection issues as well. Finally, you find that your staff, your volunteers, make fewer mistakes if they've got written guidance to follow and that they can refer to if they've got any questions. So what are the recommended procedures I think you should document? Well, they are, first of all, new staff training and refresher training for existing staff, and that includes volunteers. This is the idea that when they join your organisation, if they're handling any amount of personal data, they should at least have a very basic understanding of what the law requires of them. And that includes things that are common sense for you and me, like don't use the organisation's personal data for your own purposes. Secondly, it's good to have a documented procedure for responding to data protection rights requests. And the common example is the subject access requests. But there's also a host of other rights that people can exercise. Next one's very important, which is what you do in a data breach scenario. So having a written guide for assessing the severity of the breach, knowing who to tell, knowing whether you need to be telling the regulator or the people involved, that just gives you so much more confidence in dealing with that in the time frame required. And finally, does your organisation transfer personal data outside of the UK? That might commonly be the case if you've got a service provider which aren't based in the UK. So it might be, for example, a US-based software provider, which is very common, particularly if you use MailChimp online. If so, then there are additional steps which I haven't outlined here, and there may be additional documents that you need to ensure that you've got, and a procedure for knowing whether you're transferring that data in a way that is legally compliant. So now we're going to talk about the second aspect of documentation, and these are the specific documents that you need. So if we go over to the next slide, please, Helen. These are the ones that are named in data protection law. So I've said these are probably the bare minimum. It does, of course, depend on exactly what your organisation is doing, but this is a very good starting point. So privacy policies, also known as privacy notices. These tell people whose personal data you process what you're doing with that data. And the law says that best practice is to have 3 privacy policies, one for staff and volunteers, and you can refer to that in your employment contracts and volunteer agreements, one for job applicants, and you can refer to that in your application form. And then the third one is what we call your main privacy policy. And this is for everybody else, basically. So it covers all your processing of personal data relating to your customers, your suppliers, people on your marketing lists, etc. And you'd put that main privacy policy on your website and refer to it in your T's and C's if you have them. Good news, the ICO has a template for this. You just need to go on the ICO website, download it, and fill it in. Document number 2, record of processing activities. And this is an internal document, so you're not putting it on your website. And it brings together all of the information that you've got in your privacy policies, keeps it all in one place. Good news again, there's an ICO template you can use and fill in, so it shouldn't take you too long. The next document is a data breach register. Now, not all data breaches are reportable to the regulator or to the people whose information is affected by the breach. However, you do need to be recording that internally, and that means you need to have a data breach register to record that in writing. Again, good news, the ICO has a template and you can download it from their website. Next one on the list, data processor contracts. So by way of explanation, if your organisation engages a contractor or outside company or organisation to provide some sort of service where they're processing personal data you share with them, then we would call them a data processor. And the law says that you need to have a written contract with them, and that written contract needs to contain specific clauses, which we call the data processing clauses. Where can you find these clauses? On the ICO website. Once you've got these written contracts in place, keep them all in one place and you can refer to them as required. Next one on the list, and we're almost at the end. So you must keep copies of consent if you rely on consent in the ways that you process personal data. As you'll read from the guidance, there's lots of different lawful bases or lawful grounds that you can rely on to process personal data. You get to choose between these, get to choose the most appropriate one. Consent is just one of those, but commonly you'll see consent for email marketing because you'll ask people to opt into your email marketing. Keep a record of that consent, and ideally that would be within your marketing list or marketing database. And finally, of the documents that are probably the bare minimum, if you're processing sensitive personal data, so things about people's sex, health conditions, so on, religions, or criminal conviction information, then there are additional rules that apply and you will need some additional documents there, potentially. I'm not going to go into that in detail here because it might not apply to everyone, but it's worth bearing in mind. So that pretty much covers, if we go over to the final slide, how you can become compliant or check if you think you are already compliant, that you actually do meet all the requirements at a very high level. How do we keep on top of things once we are compliant? Well, I've got some suggestions here. First of all, I've been talking about this a lot. Refresher training within the organisation is really important. The frequency of training will depend on how important data protection is to a particular person's role. It might be that they only get retrained every year or 2 years. For the person who's responsible for data protection compliance in your organisation, be it the DPO or someone who more informally is responsible, they should probably get regular training more often. The ICO has a newsletter, and I've got the URL on the slide there. You can sign up and receive fantastic updates about changes in the law and also changes to their guidance and new guidance that might be beneficial to you. And finally, we at Paris Smith, we produce loads of legal updates, which we republish on all of our socials, and I've got those on the slide. And that would be a great way to keep up with developments in the law. So that's a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of how to be compliant or check that you're compliant. I hope that's been helpful in understanding your obligations. And I'll be available at the end, of course, if anybody has any questions for the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much in particular for making it so practical and non-technical, so even I could understand it. Thank you very much for that. So our last speaker is Kevin Sawyers, the Community Building and Enterprise Officer at Action Hampshire. Kevin joined Action Hampshire in 2006 and since 2009 has been their Community Buildings Officer, supporting community halls and centres in Hampshire over a large range of different topics. And since the pandemic, he's been helping people with all the complex legislation that's come out of that and how they can face those challenges. And today he's talking about community venues, how they've been affected by the pandemic for the last 20 months and the future for the sector. So Kevin, good to see you. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Am I audible to everybody?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant. Right, great. So Helen, clicking through the slides, I'm going to whiz through the first few, just kind of doing a bit of background stuff, because you can all, if you're interested, look that up on Action Hampshire's website. So I'm employed, referencing the earlier bit from Andy, by Action Hampshire, at least I believe I am. And yeah, you'll see there a little bit about what Action Hampshire is all about. And most of our work is focused on the Hampshire County Council area, so not including Southampton, Portsmouth and the Isle of Wight or further beyond, but some bits do. And a few years ago, actually, we changed our governing document to give us more freedom to do that, to have that wider focus. So yeah, you'll see there our mission down the slide there, focusing on local people and communities, and all of our areas of work are intended to achieve those goals in one way or another. So moving on to the next slide, Helen, please. Thank you. So my specific role, as Nick has said, is to give guidance and support for community buildings. Primarily that means village halls and community centres, but any building that is open for hire by other groups and organisations and the general public for a range of different activities. And through that, I work with the charity trustees, other volunteers, paid staff, anyone involved in the managing of those buildings and the things that happen in them. On to the next one, please, Helen. Thank you. So there's just a whiz through how I can help. And obviously the down there, so I've got a wide guidance booklets on a wide range of topics, which give you a great, I hope, starting point for the various issues that you need to deal with. But then for the more detailed stuff, specialist support, I can point you on towards people like Paris Smith here for the more detailed specialist advice that you might need on certain issues, including obviously legal stuff. So moving on, please, Helen, thank you. Yeah, so if you're not already connected with us and you're in the Hampshire area, then please do. I know there's a few organisations based in Sussex. If that's you, then welcome. It's great to have you with us. Our counterpart organisation in Sussex is on the screen there, Action in Rural Sussex. So if you're not already, make sure you connect with them, and either they'll be able to help you directly or point you towards people who can. And if we've got anyone from further beyond that, then you can look up our counterpart support body on the website there through our national body ACRE, and again they'll either help you directly or point you on to who you need to be in touch with if you're not already. On to the next one, please. So three things today from me, really. An opportunity to reflect on the last 20 months of the pandemic. It's 20 months now, and then I'll look at where we are now, the current situation, and then forwards, opportunities and challenges moving forward, still with the with COVID-19 very much with us and likely to be with us for a long time in one way or another, but hopefully coming out of the worst of the pandemic. So onward, please, Helen, to an opportunity to reflect on, like I said, 20 months. Who would have predicted this? It's obviously been an enormous shock. So much of what's normal and familiar to us has been put on hold. We've had 2 or 3, is it, periods of sort of pretty much complete lockdown where for several months we've only been allowed out of our homes for essential purposes. Obviously, I don't think anyone would have predicted that. Personal difficulties and challenges. Many of you will have had been severely ill yourself, perhaps, or loved ones. And some of you, I'm sure, will know people who have passed away due to COVID. So my sympathies if that is the case for you. Plenty of people, trustees of the volunteers, have reviewed their priorities and stepped away from their role. And we've heard that mentioned briefly, I think, earlier today, that's an issue that many organisations are struggling with. That's been one significant impact, and it's of course kind of been a great struggle for people who've relied on groups and activities that have been forced to stop for much of the last 20 months and perhaps still haven't really got going again, or are just getting up and running again over the last few months since the legal restrictions were eased back in, what was it, towards the end of July. So on to the next one, Helen, please. But there have also been a few positives out of the midst of the pandemic. It's given us an opportunity to pause in some ways for community buildings. It's perhaps given a new and unexpected opportunity to carry out various improvement and maintenance works. And I know plenty of halls and centres have taken that opportunity. And for any kind of organisation, business, public body, there's been space perhaps to reimagine how you can better achieve your mission, your purpose, what your organisation is there for. For some organisations, at least, there's been a financial windfall. Like I said on the slide there, the business support grants that the government set up have been something of a blunt instrument, probably by necessity, just because they wanted to get them going so quickly. They haven't been means tested as such. So I know for some, perhaps I think particularly smaller village halls, the grants have been above and beyond what was needed to cover the loss of revenue. So that, for those that this does apply to, that unexpected financial boon could be put to good use, and I'm sure has been, to sort of carry out improvement works that you perhaps weren't figuring you'd be able to do, like, I don't know, replacing the lighting so that it's more effective, more energy efficient, things like that. And also, I think certainly some halls and centres have had their profile raised by many services being run from community buildings, food banks, the emergency efforts being coordinated from your buildings, vaccination clinics, things like that. So perhaps all of you can benefit from that sort of community venues are just higher up in a lot of people's minds now. So moving on, Helen, please. So where we are now, I think there's some hope. There's also, I think, some nervousness as well. The question of whether restrictions will be reintroduced in the UK is very much a live issue. The question of whether they should be is very much alive, and differing views on that might be causing tension and conflict in your organisation and among the people that use your facilities. Lots of activities are up and running again, but again, there could be conflicts, differences of opinion with, for example, ventilation and wearing face coverings. Kind of how rigorously should they be? Not enforced usually, but requested, or should we kind of say, right, the worst is over, if people aren't vaccinated, then tough, carry on. And so there'll be differences of opinion among your people, your users, and again, that can cause conflict. And like I've said, I think many people have reviewed their priorities and stepped back from their role as a volunteer and organizer, a charity trustee. So lots of groups and charities are struggling to get back to where they were. So next slide, please, Helen. As I've mentioned, though, I think there are opportunities. There's a greater awareness of community buildings. Perhaps that might make it easier to promote your events and activities. I think there's more enthusiasm for volunteering. Many people got involved with the mutual aid groups and other aspects of volunteering through the pandemic, and perhaps that increased enthusiasm can be harnessed. So make sure you're connected with your local council for voluntary service and the volunteer bureau that most of them run. If you're not sure, if you're in Hampshire and you're not sure who that is, then have a look on the website just in the middle there, hampshirecvs.org.uk, and that will point you towards source for localized support for your area. But just a really quick tip from me about volunteering, it can be helpful to offer lots of different ways for people to get involved, including kind of ad hoc low-key things that people can dip in and out of as they want, perhaps helping with events and occasional projects. If you have a list of a sort of kind of informal friends of group, then you can email them when you've got an event coming up and say, hey, can you help out with, I don't know, providing the refreshments, bake a cake for us. And then people can dip in and out as they feel they can without any firm commitment on their part. And perhaps down the line, they'll get more involved. That would be fab, wouldn't it? But it just gives people a kind of low-key into getting involved with your organisation. So on to the next one, please, Helen. Thank you. So looking to the future then, the first issue there, recruiting trustees and other volunteers, obviously not a new challenge. It's an ongoing issue for so many charities and organisations, but for some of you, I'm sure it will be more urgent now with trying to replace those who have stepped away from their role. So do access all of the support you can and get ideas from other people. Talk to your peers, people doing the same kind of thing as you in the neighbouring village, district, whatever. And one of the ways that we network people together is through the Basecamp platform, which is a thing that organisations can subscribe to. We've done that, and that means that everyone in the Hampshire area running a community building can access that. Just drop me a line and then we'll get you set up, and you can use the message board system there to connect with something like, what is it, about 180, 190 people from community buildings across Hampshire to find out what they're doing about different situations, share ideas with them. So do use that if you aren't already. I know plenty of you are. If kind of things are getting desperate, then one option which a lot of people aren't aware of is for your, if you're in a parish or town council area, then this is a kind of common, not common exactly, but known thing for them to do. The parish town council can become what's called the sole charity trustee of the organisation. So the charity remains, but doesn't have to find individuals to take on the charity trustee role anymore, because the parish or the town council is the charity trustee. And that's a much better option than a viable building falling into disuse and becoming moribund, I think. Obviously, the council needs to be willing. It's not something that they can be forced into. The Charity Commission isn't desperately keen on this, it's fair to say, but they will allow it kind of if you've tried and not been successful in recruiting new people to be your charity trustees. And there are some disadvantages. It can lead to confusion as time goes on, particularly around the parish council getting confused about its role. So it's manageable, it's viable, but it's a kind of last resort really to keep the charity and the building going as a sort of charitable ongoing concern. But so do consider that if kind of you are really struggling to get trustees on board. I've got some free guidance to kind of get you started on it and other governance issues. And then obviously Paris Smith can give you the more detailed, specific advice that you might need to kind of put those things into action. On to the next slide, Helen, please. I've just skipped ahead of myself ever so slightly. And Nick has talked about the free charity forum service that Paris Smith offers. So do connect with them about that. On again, please, Helen. So one Other big issue looking to the future, and I'm doing some work on this. I have produced a draft toolkit to help you with increasing the range of ways you get income in and the variety of hirers you have. And those of you on my mailing list will have seen that and had a chance to comment on that. I think please carry on commenting. I think now is a good moment for new ideas, especially if you aren't yet back at full capacity after the pandemic. You've still got space in your building. So there's two ways here to become more financially secure by increasing your income from different sources and getting a wider variety of hirers into your building. And also, through doing that, you'll increase your role, your impact in the community. A wider range of hirers means a wider range of activities, so more things that people can come to, and opportunities for everyone in your community to come along. So moving on, Helen, please. So there's some ideas for increasing your income. I'll just pause there for a sec so that you can have a look through them. And in the draft toolkit I've produced, there are loads more, and I'd really value your ideas too, so that they can go into the to the toolkit. So there are a few ideas that you could explore for increasing the income for your organisation separate from your hirers. And then onwards, please. And then thank you, Helen. So there are some things to consider when you're trying to increase the variety of hirers. The first question I think to ask is who else might want to use your space and isn't already? What facilities do you have that would draw in potential hirers? As Nick mentioned, you do need to consider who your beneficiaries are as a charity, kind of what you're set up to do, and use that is directly for the benefit of your beneficiaries must take priority. Other use, so for example by businesses, say for their own meetings and activity, is okay as long as it is secondary, doesn't get in the way of your primary purpose. The point of the a lot of the stuff I'm talking about here is income generation for your organisation to then put towards your primary purpose. So it's okay for you to do it, but it mustn't take priority. It mustn't crowd out your sort of charitable community usage. Just moving on. Oh, sorry, no, not moving on just yet. We could just go back to the previous one briefly. Sorry about that. So yeah, just a few other ideas there. And the bottom one, play to your strengths, leading into the next slide. Thank you, Helen. Consider what is your unique selling point? What is it that you offer that other local facilities don't? And that's kind of both other community buildings in your community or nearby. It's really good to link with them, collaborate with them, so that you're not too much competing for the same kind of audience, if you like. But also other perhaps hotels, for example, that you might have commercial spaces in your neighbourhood. Try to work with them as well, and kind of major on your unique selling point. What is it that you offer that they don't? And that could be low cost, like you'll see there. If your major competition, if you like, is a hotel, then probably you'll be able to offer facilities at a lower cost than them. Play that up. That's valuable for lots of people. Low cost birthday parties for children, for example, you could specialize in that. Okay, so moving on then, just to wrap things up, I think. So the last over year and a half now has obviously been an enormously challenging, difficult time. There will be some more challenges ahead, but I think there are also opportunities. There's been a great big growth of community spirit over the last year and a bit. Can we harness that? And you're all tremendous examples of that community spirit. Many of you are volunteers, so you volunteer your time and energy free of charge. Those of you who are paid staff, I'm pretty sure you work more hours than you're paid for, or at a rate that you could probably exceed by working in a different role elsewhere. So I think everyone here is a great example of that community spirit, and your organisations contribute to community strength so much. Your role is to bring people together, provide a place where vital services and activities can be accessed by people. So I hope you can benefit from that new atmosphere, that the kind of increased community spirit and volunteering. Perhaps you might get a more positive response from businesses when you seek their support. And also maybe there's more recognition from government nationally, public sector locally. Maybe we can take advantage of that as well. Show how we make our corner of the world a better place. So yeah, try and take advantage of those. Yeah, thank you for being with us today. Hope you can have some relaxing time over the Christmas holiday season, and may 2022 be calmer and generally happier.